Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for The Devil in the Dark, which is episode 27 of season 1 of Star Trek The Original Series. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of the original series, one episode at a time. In this video I will cover the episode A Devil in the Dark. So So in the Dark is the episode where the Enterprise is sent to aid a mining colony whose workers are being killed off by a monster, and Kirk investigates only to find that in fact it is a silicon life form who is defending itself from the miners who are unintentionally and unaware are killing all of its eggs and destroying its children, and it's the last surviving member of its species, so it's at risk of becoming extinct, so it's just defending itself. And while the miners try to kill the creature, Kirk actually heals the creature and manages to negotiate with the miners and let them know what's going on. So they negotiate a situation where the Horda, as they're called, work with the miners to help them mine, and the miners become rich and everyone's happy. So I gotta be honest, I talk a lot before about what I liked when I was a teenager, when I first got into Star Trek, and sometimes I've been like, oh, if I was 14 or when I was a teenager, this would have been my top 10. Well, for this episode, this would have been in my top 10 most overrated episodes when I was a teenager. I didn't hate this episode, but I didn't really like it that much, and I was actually quite surprised that so many people liked it, and I was like, bah, it's not that good. Why did everyone like this episode? Now, more recent, and in fact very recently, up until just like 5 years ago, because I looked at ratings I gave this episode 10 years ago and I gave it a 5 out of 10. But more recently, maybe even just within the last couple of years, I finally saw what people liked about this episode. I don't know why it took me so long, but I did start to grow an appreciation for this episode. Now, I still not ready to say that this is one of the best of the original series or anything like that, but I definitely like this episode a lot more than I used to. Because I mean, essentially, it does, and I was always aware of this, but maybe I didn't appreciate it so much. I don't know, maybe because I found like the mining sets and the miners themselves kind of boring, and I kind of glossed over and got bored with this episode because of that. But at its core, and especially like the more I analyze it, which I do, which is I think when I first started to appreciate this episode, when I did my season by season review for my channel, because I talked about this before. When I watch episodes of Star Trek that I'm going to review on my channel, it's different than just watching them for leisure, because I pay more close attention, try to analyze and really think about the episode and overanalyze it, and sometimes I end up coming to different conclusions or saying things in a different way. And the more I look deeper into this episode, the more I appreciate it, actually, because this is kind of like the opposite, or maybe even a correction of the episode The Man Trap, which I was not a huge fan of that episode, and I'm still not. And I thought part of the problem with The Man Trap is that it presents this monster as going around killing people. It tries to get you to feel sympathy for it because it's the last of its kind, but it doesn't really do a good job of it. It's because it still portrays it as a monster who'd rather kill people than survive. So it doesn't, and then plus Kirk never he's always for killing it. He never doesn't really care that he's wiping out a species. So they kind of failed at their message, and here they actually did it better. Like, they did it correctly. They showed a situation that was just a massive misunderstanding, and it is like true to real life, a lot of conflicts, a lot of horror, a lot of deaths, and just feuds, all boil down to misunderstandings, to not communicating properly, or people misunderstanding or not being aware of what the situation. Had they had more knowledge or more understanding of what was actually going on, they may have behaved differently, and perhaps conflict would have been avoided altogether. And I think this episode does a really good job at that. But moreover, I do like how the episode itself presents it as a horror story, kind of just like The Man Trap, where it shows a monster killing people. And it's very horror-esque the way that they show these scenes at the start of the episode, where they show this guy who's like being left alone to guard and is afraid for his life. He's like, oh, is it really okay? And the other miner's like, yeah, you'll be fine, just put your phaser out. And then we see a monster come out. As soon as the others leave, the monster just pops out of nowhere and just kills him instantly. He goes, ah! And you feel bad for him, because this poor guy who was scared for his life, and he instantly got murdered. And then they show a couple more deaths. I think that we see a red shirt death from the Enterprise when they show up too, and so you feel really bad for them. You feel like this is a monster movie, that there's a monster going around killing people. But then it kind of pulls the wool out from under you, saying that she is just protecting herself and her young, because the miners, they didn't know this, but they showed up and just started destroying all of its eggs, which is, and her whole job is to protect her young, because of they're her species. She's the last survivor of her species, and if these young don't survive, then her whole species becomes extinct. And so these miners come in and just start killing all of her babies, and she tries to warn them off, but they don't listen. So she has to resort to killing them, and then she tries to sabotage their equipment to force them to leave, which does show intelligence. I think that Kirk and Spock took a little too long to pick up on that fact, that specifically targeting the piece of equipment that's going to force them to leave, it does show intelligence. But Kirk was still acting like this was just a wounded, an animal. And it wasn't until Spock mind melded with the Horder that he finally realized this was an intelligent, sentient being. But yeah, so that's a great way to pull the wool over your eyes. Present this horror monster movie, and then all of a sudden be like, actually, it's not a monster. Actually, it sees the humans as monsters because they came and started killing their babies. And it was just, a massive misunderstanding, because they weren't aware that this, Horder even existed. And a piece of information that I kind of missed out on, or I focused more on this time I watched it, was that the Horder was actually living in peace with the miners for many years, because the miner once said, well, we've been here for 50 years and we haven't experienced these deaths until just recently. And that's because the Horder didn't care. The Horder was perfectly willing to share the space with the humans. It wasn't until the humans dug deeper and started and got into her territory and started killing her children that she had an issue with them. So it was a direct result of the miners killing her children and invading her territory directly. And in fact, like at the end, they negotiate a coexistence where the Horder are perfectly willing to dig all the tunnels for the miners that give them more access to the metals that will make them rich. Because, they don't mind coexisting with the miners. They just, don't like their babies being killed, which is fair. And it was kind of like, I don't know, I think maybe it's realistic, especially considering a lot of recent events of how ignorant people can be, that this is probably actually is realistic, but the way that the leader of the miner colony was being really obtuse when, because that big silicon ball that Spock was like, wow, this is a really weird thing. Like, what is this thing? This is not something that's found in nature. And the miner guy was like, hey, did you come here to, like, do a scientific study, or did you come here to save us from a dying monster? Like, what the fuck? But I think he was being obtuse because it's obvious that this really weird thing that shouldn't exist, maybe that has something to do with this monster and something to do with exactly what's going on. But alright, here's a little nitpick I have about the episode, though. Spock obviously has an inkling that he doesn't know for sure, but he's obviously, and he even mentions that he's formulating a theory that those silicon balls have something to do with the monster, and so he must to some level think that perhaps this is their young or eggs or something of that sort, but he says nothing. And not only that, Kirk outright asks, because Spock tells Kirk, don't destroy any of those balls, and Kirk is like, why, what's going on, like, do you have a theory? And Spock is like, I'm formulating one, and doesn't tell Kirk. And at one point, like when he's first discussing the whole situation with McCoy, he brings up the possibility of a silicon life form. McCoy's like, silicon life form, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Spock, you're dumb, this is stupid. And then, but Spock is looking at the ball, and he's obviously thinking that this has something to do with it. And Kirk downright asks him to, to tell him what he's thinking. And Spock's like, no, McCoy's had enough fun already making fun of my silicon life form theory. I think I'll save this. Like, that doesn't seem very logical to me. And the fact that he kept withholding this theory from Kirk seemed very plot like contrivance. Like, there's no reason for him to withhold this information. Like, if he was being a logical Vulcan, he absolutely would say, well, even if he didn't know for sure, he'd be like, I feel like there's a possibility that this, well, not, he wouldn't use the word feel, obviously, but he would be like, I'm speculating there's a possibility that these silicon balls are somehow involved with this monster. Perhaps they're a different form, perhaps the monster's protecting them in some way, perhaps they're precious to him, but perhaps this is why the monster started attacking the colonists in the first place. And to be honest, like, that's obvious, and the miners were being obtuse for not realizing it. Kirk is being obtuse for not realizing this, because the miners themselves even said, oh, we were fine for 50 years and they had left and there was no monster, and then all of a sudden, right around the same time we started digging deeper into these caverns and found these balls, all of a sudden the monster starts attacking them. It doesn't take a fucking rocket scientist to see the correlation there. And so Spock should have at the very least pointed that out, and Kirk and all of them should have seen that. I'm not expecting them to know exactly that those are the eggs of the monster, but they should realize that it has something to do with the fact that the monster, or at least the possibility that it could have something to do with the fact that why the monster all of a sudden started killing all these people out of the blue. Anyway, so that is a nitpick I do have with this episode. Not on the topic of nitpicks, another scene about this episode really bothered me is when, before Kirk really knew what the deal was with the Horta, they were still chasing after the monster, and there was that cycling thing that was going to that produces the air, and for the colonists, like, broke down, and so the colony is going to have to be evacuated because they had like 10 hours of air left. So he wanted the majority of the miners to leave, but the leader guy was like, well, a small group of us want to stay behind and help you hunt the monster. And Kirk is like, well, no, we don't need your help, we're fine. And he's like, no, we're not going anywhere, we insist. And Kirk's like, all right, fine. And Kirk says, well, we don't have enough weapons for you. And he's like, well, we'll use clubs. And Kirk's like, okay, all right, fine, we'll use your help. And then we see later the security people organizing the miners, being like, okay, you go with this officer, you go with that officer, you go there. And so there's many problems with this. First of all, why in the hell would Kirk actually say, oh yeah, sure, you can stay behind with clubs? And why the fuck would they want to stay behind with clubs? Like this, as we saw at the start of the episode, they were armed with phasers, and the monster still easily killed them. What the hell do they think a club is going to do? Why, when their right mind, would they be dumb enough to try to hunt this, killing monster that could easily kill people with a phaser with a fucking club? And why the hell would Kirk be dumb enough to let them do it? None of that makes sense. And also, what happened to their phasers? Like Kirk says, we don't have enough phasers for you. But they had their own phasers. We saw them before the Enterprise shows up. They had phasers enough to go around. They weren't powerful. They were apparently Type 1 phasers, not the Type 2 phasers that the Enterprise crew has. And they're ineffective against the monster. But I guarantee you they'd be more effective in the fucking club. What the hell? Anyway. So that was really irritating. The other thing that was irritating is that, as I said, we saw Kirk specifically said they could be assigned to work with each security officer, and we saw the security chief portioning them out and saying, okay, you go with Lieutenant what's his face, and you go with Ensign and what's his head, and so they were being paired up. And then later in the episode, we saw all the miners together by themselves without a Starfleet officer around, just sitting there talking about how they want to kill the monster. How the fuck did that happen? I thought they were all split up and paired up with Starfleet officers, and it's so they could have the contrived moment where the miners form the angry mob, and the clubs, I suppose, are probably supposed to be like pitchforks, and then they go and overrun the security officers and try to kill the Horde. But then Kirk very easily, instantly talks him down. So that feels like that whole thing was anticlimactic, and plus it was dumb and it was built on contrivance and shouldn't have been there in the first place. I don't know. Just my humble opinion. But getting back into stuff I liked about the episode, I did love the iconic McCoy line, "I'm a doctor, not a bricklayer." I think that's one of his famous, it's not the most famous, "I'm a doctor, not a line." I'm a doctor, not a bricklayer. And then Kirk is like, you're a healer. Bones, it's in pain, heal it. And actually, once he gets in, and he does figure it out, and he manages to get a silicon-based substance that they have in the Enterprise and get them to beam it down, and uses it to heal the monster. And he's like, I like how impressed he is with himself. So I think that's a great McCoy moment. The Spock mind meld with the Horder is kind of interesting. It's really interesting that Spock says, it refers to itself as a Horda. But they obviously don't use speech in the same way or have language in the same way that humanoids do. So how would it have a humanoid word that you need a humanoid mouth in order to pronounce named for itself? That's what I was wondering. Shouldn't his name sound like two rocks scraping together, because that's how it would communicate? I'm just saying. Anyway, so yeah, but the Spock mind melding with the Horda, I don't know. It's something about Leonard Nimoy's performance where he goes brain. And I heard this funny behind the scenes story. I usually don't like Shatner, but I kind of like this story. When they were filming that episode, and and Leonard Nimoy says his line, and William Shatner's just like, say that again. He's like, brain, and then William Shatner goes to the crew and is like, hey, someone get this guy an aspirin. Kind of being a dick, probably. But the way that he's like screeching, I'm never alone, a high pitch. I mean, I get it. The Hoarder's in pain and he's connected to the Hoarder, so he's experiencing that pain. But I don't know. There's something that just felt a bit cheesy about it. I don't know. But yeah, and all right. So another nitpick. Sorry, getting a lot of them. The air filter thingy, or the pump that provides all the oxygen for the mine, broke because the Hoarder stole it. I don't know why the Hoarder didn't just dissolve it with his acid. I guess because the plot required it to be back by the end of the episode. But also, Scotty was unable to come up, and Scotty's attitude is kind of shitty. Like when Kirk's like, can you make this a piece of equipment? And Scotty's like, oh, that old thing, that antiquated piece of junk. And Kirk's like, no, seriously, like a lot of people are gonna die unless they get this. And Scotty's like, oh well, I guess I can try. I mean, I don't know. That seems very kind of unprofessional and cavalier way of handling this important piece of equipment. Plus, Scotty's able to come up with like this temporary thing that only lasts 48 hours. How convenient to have a ticking clock for the plot. But if it's so antiquated, shouldn't it be easy to make? And I know this is the day before the days they introduced replicators, but I still can't help but think, can they just replicate one? But let's rule that out. Let's say there are no replicators in this time period. Spotty should be able to manufacture, if it's that simplistic, with using the material they have on the Enterprise. He should have the ingenuity to create an actual functioning one. But of course, that's not what the plot required. But yeah, that's just another nitpick. Yeah, I don't know. So I do like this episode better than I used to, because I do think that message of, I do like the reveal the monster actually turned out to be the victim, and from its perspective, humans were the monster. That was a very good twist, and it's definitely done way better than the TNG episode that ripped us off home soil, which I'll have to cover later. So it's definitely way better than that. So it actually does a really good job at this reveal. I do want to make that clear. But I don't know. I think it does drag on a bit, and the resolution comes a bit too easily. I don't know. But I don't know. There was another part that I actually liked, the fact that Kirk was all gung-ho about killing it, and Spock's like suggests capturing, and Kirk gets really fucking pissed off at him. He's like, Mr. Spock, I don't recall saying we could capture it. Spock's like, well, I just thought, and he's like, well, I didn't order that. And he tried to order Spock to leave, force him to leave, and Spock was just like, I think I'm more valuable here. So Kirk was so pissed at Spock that he tried to get rid of him, but then later on he actually, just for suggestion that they perhaps maybe don't kill it, but when Kirk is confronted with it and can clearly see it and see how it's intelligent it is, he himself doesn't kill it. And even when Spock shows up, he says to Kirk, he's like, kill it! It's gonna, that's more of over concern for his captain, which makes sense. I buy that. And Kirk's like, no, let's hold off on killing it. Something's up here. And the fact that he's witty and intelligent enough to see that things don't really match up, that the situation isn't what it seems, I really like that. I think it speaks really highly to Kirk's character, and I do like the flip that that they're showing a captain who's willing to change his mind, who's not so staunch in his opinions and ideals that he can never change. Someone who can who's flexible, who can adjust to the situation, and that's what really makes a great person, by the way. Being that flexibility, being able to adjust and not being so rigid, and being able to change your mind. And the fact that Kirk went from almost kicking Spock out of the planet just for suggesting not killing the creature, to outright for ordering people not to kill it and protecting the creature and then helping to communicate and to heal it. That was a huge character development that I think was really well earned, and as I said, it shows a good captain who's able to adjust to a situation like that. So I actually did really like that as well. But the one thing, another nitpick this brings up, is when Kirk is with Spock and Kirk tries to order Spock away, and Spock says, because one of the reasons Kirk brings up is, because I'm the first, I'm the captain, you're the first officer. It doesn't make, it's, completely unacceptable to put us both in danger, because if we both can't die, we're not expendable. One of us needs to survive to command the Enterprise, which is actually great logic and actually should apply for every other episode where they throw this logic out the window and have Kirk, Spock, and McCoy beam down to the planet. The whole command staff put themselves in danger episode after episode, which actually doesn't make any sense. But here, so Kirk finally speaks some logic, and Spock rejects this logic by saying, the chances of both of us dying are some stupid number like 5,871 to 1 or some bullshit. And Kirk's like, and so the scene's played as it was meant to show that Kirk was being obtuse, but he's not actually being obtuse, and I don't buy Spock's odds. I think that's bullshit. If Kirk and Spock, maybe you could buy that, you could sell that to me if they separated and they were two totally different sides of the mine. But if they are together hunting the creature, I think the odds of them both dying are pretty fucking high, because they would both be in the same amount of danger as the other, so the monster could just as easily kill both of them at the same time. So I think his odds are bullshit, and I think Kirk was actually in the right. Just saying. Yeah, so I think that's pretty much all I have to say about this episode. So now let me go to thanking my Patreon supporters. Of course, thanks. Keeps the channel going. So appreciative towards. So Patreon supporters who really helped the channel get going. We got Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky, Matty Jester, Joel Lavals, Brian A., Alessandro Migonacio, Norman Buchwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, Allison Fordyce, and Brandon Neal Howells. Thank you all so much for your support. Very much appreciated. So we have a couple of patron comments for this episode that we'll get into. First comment is from Ricky. It's funny that there are some episodes in Star Trek I initially didn't like at first, but when I rewatched the franchise and pay close attention, I come to think better of the episode, and this is one of them. I really like this episode now and appreciate the powerful message that it sends regarding the colonization and interference with the environment. I also like that the creature wasn't exactly the villain, but was protecting its family and environment. The colonists who, although had good intentions, were the ones in the wrong. This is what Star Trek does best when it does social commentary very well, and this episode still holds up, so my rating is a 9 out of 10. So Ricky's feelings on this episode very close to mine, because I at first also didn't think much of this episode and did actually come to appreciate it. Although I'm not sure if this episode really speaks to colonization specifically, because in the end they let the miners stay. But I suppose it could. I could. In a way, it does show how they, colonists can bring diseases and kill off indigenous people without intending to do it. So, I suppose there's that. The next comment is from Brandon Neal Howells. Devil in the Dark, one of the best TOS cold opens and the best episodes. The miners initially come across as greedy people only looking to make a profit, but on further reflection, I think this episode might be an allegory for Frankenstein. It's hard not to laugh at the hoarder, though. It looks like homemade pizza I used to make on English muffins. I find the mind meld between the hoarder and Spock oddly touching, even after so many rewatches. An excellent The Monster is Not a Villain story. I have only two complaints. The accents on a couple of minors sound like they come straight from a gangster film. And the end joke about Spock's ears is just trying too hard to be funny. Because of those faults, I can only give this episode an 8 out of 10. Alright, so first of all, the accents of the miners. When I was watching this episode, I noticed that too, and I think that was done specifically, not so much to be like gangsters, but so much to be like to emulate blue class workers. So I think they were going for that blue class worker feel, and so they were trying to cast actors who could play like miners or construction workers and stuff like that. And I do think of like the New York construction workers and stuff like that. So I think I actually think that was actually a smart decision to do that. Now, I didn't think about the Frankenstein analogy. That's actually a really good point. I didn't think about that one. That makes a lot of sense. The appearance of the hoarder, yes, actually, that's something I forgot to mention. That bothered me as well. It's not so much that it looked like a pizza. It's more of like the way it moved, because it was so obviously just some guy with a costume over top of just going like this underneath. I tried to imagine how good this would look with modern, computerized special effects CGI, and how better that would actually look to this. This would probably make me think much better of the episode, to be honest. And yeah. Yeah, anyway. Oh, the whole thing about making a joke about Spock's ears at the end. I kind of stopped commenting on those like little things they do at the end of each episode where they go, ha, 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 because I hate all of them. I think they're all dumb. I never find any of them funny, and I just hate every time they do this. But this is just a result of it being from the 60s, and so I've stopped commenting on those, but I hate all of them. Anyway, next comment is from Maddie Jester, who says, I think this is a great episode. It feels like quintessential Star Trek. Something or someone may seem different and scary, but if you can put yourself in their position, you can empathize and understand that they're not as bad as you thought they were. One of Star Trek's most endearing messages. I would also like to see the Hoarder again, maybe on lower decks helping the Cerritos with the problem. I'm sure there's comedy gold to mine there. 9 silicon modules out of 10. Yes. Hoarder on lower decks. I'm all for that. That seems like something lower decks might do as well, because you know how they like bringing back these original series one-offs. So yeah, I don't know how much comedy I'm sure there could be. I could imagine a Hoarder like being all silly or something like that, the way the exocomps were. So yeah, I'm all for that idea as well. So my rating for The Devil in the Dark out of 10, I'm gonna give this an 8. Extremely good. Not as positive as a 9. For me, I wouldn't put this in the top 10 of TOS, but that's just me. I'd still give it an 8, though, even though I brought up a lot of nitpicks. They are overall just nitpicks, and most of them anyway, and don't interfere too much with my enjoyment of and the power of the message. For me, what brings it down to an 8 has more to do with what I said with the episode just being kind of boring, and kind of the sets not being very good, and just having that plain like look to it. And then the resolution resolving itself far too easily, kind of maybe being a little anticlimactic. But I do love the turn in Kirk, the way he goes from wanting to absolutely kill this under any circumstances to protecting it. And I love the whole flip of the monster is actually the victim. thing. I think that, as I said, I think it's done well. And there are examples of it not being done well, which I'll get to when I get to Next Generation, the episode Home Soil, because it wasn't done well then, but it's done well here. So it does deserve some praise, which is why it gets as high as an 8 for me. But yeah, not much higher than that. So that is it for my review of The Devil in the Dark. So coming up next on my channel, next Monday, I will be releasing another new TOS review, Errand of Mercy, and then on Wednesday I will be doing my revisited for City on the Edge of Forever over on Patreon. And then on Thursday I'm going to finish my coverage of Season 1 of the original series, finally coming to the end of Season 1, with Operation Annihilate, a new review that will be out Thursday. So yeah, be sure to check out my channel for all of that and many more reviews on other Star Trek stuff and many other shows as well. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.